My guest on the podcast today is Jens Heycke. Jens is the author of the book Out of the Melting Pot and Into the Fire. I was fascinated when I saw Jens's perspectives on conversations with Coleman, and I thought that with all of the events happening in the world right now to do with multiculturalism and diversity, he'd be the perfect person to have this conversation with and also try and figure out amongst all the chaos if there is a way forward. And I wasn't disappointed. We had a fascinating conversation where we covered different cultures throughout history and in the modern world. And I think you guys are going to enjoy his perspective. So without further ado, let's get into it. Jens Heycke, welcome to the Rattlesnake TV podcast. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jake.
It's my pleasure. So first of all, your book, Out of the Melting Pot Into the Fire. Tell me a little bit about why you wrote it and the problem that you're trying to solve there.
Yeah, the reason I wrote it is because, I come from an immigrant family. My father came over from Germany when he was 18, and he was, quickly adopted and became an American. He joined the Army within a year of arriving here. He was a citizen within 2 years. And it was just wonderful how he got adopted into this country so quickly. And over the years, we've seen that with so many other people of different backgrounds coming to the United States and becoming an Americans in the course of a few years, or at least within a generation. And, as I was going through graduate school, I was seeing that ethic kind of start to fade, where people were starting to be treated more and more not as individuals who could become Americans, but as members of distinct groups who were encouraged to kind of remain separate instead of integrating and adopting that shared American identity. So I was really troubled, by that development over the years. And I wanted to look at what the consequences are of treating people as members of groups rather than individuals. Go back in history, go around the world. How has that worked out in other places? How has that worked out in Yugoslavia when you treated people as members of separate groups and gave them different treatment based on group identity? And as you'll see in the book, it's a really troubling experience around the world in history. What's happened when we've done that?
I think oftentimes we don't really think about history when we talk about multiculturalism, because I think that we're very modern day centric in our conversation about multiculturalism, because it's obviously a big problem in terms of Europe and what's happening over there. And then you get a lot of talk about, when Donald Trump was in power, about building a wall, and you have this tension in America about the southern border and also the northern border now and the things that are happening there. But sometimes you don't really take yourself out of the bubble and think, well, throughout history, how has this played out? Because it's easy to catastrophize about multiculturalism, but then it's very important to also have that historical context as well. So what led you to want to write this book? And were the results that you got after your studies different did they change your mind at all?
They confirmed kind of what I was seeing, and I'd already had some experience with this. I started out as an academic, by the way. My background is really in Near Eastern, early Islamic history, and the early Islamic Empire was confronted with that challenge of integrating people of different ethnicities, and it was very effective at doing that. And during my research, that's one of the things I focused on. How was it that this tiny group of people that began with the Prophet Muhammad, how did he integrate all these people, these Persians and Byzantines, and get them to work together as a cohesive whole? And so that's long been a problem that I focused on, and I see the same lessons repeating over and over through history, starting as early as the Roman Empire, going up through the Islamic Empire and the Ottomans, all the way to the current day. That the only way for a multi-ethnic society to function is if you form some sort of superordinate identity that everybody can share in. So people don't have to give up their individual heritages, but they have to come together and form something that makes them a cohesive whole. And we've seen that on and on through history. If you take the other path, what I would call the multicultural path, where you keep people separate, you end up with a fragmented society, and often with a society where people end up killing each other or
Yeah.
very much at odds. And you only need to look at the number of genocides that occurred during the 20th century
Yep.
to see the extreme results of how that can happen. And we can talk about specific examples of that, and some of them are so striking where you just can't believe how a society that was really working pretty well just completely broke down because they went down that path of treating people as members of separate groups.
So I've got a little bit of a different perspective about this because before the podcast, I mentioned to you that I'm in Chiang Mai at the moment in Thailand. And basically every single month I try to maybe move to a different city, sometimes to a different country. And I enjoy the spoils of being able to live around the world. And one of the great joys in life for me is being able to experience different cultures. But also when I look around and I go to a place like Japan, I see the way that they're very Japanese.
Absolutely.
They don't really, the idea of multiculturalism for them is completely foreign. And I don't judge them for that whatsoever. But then when I go to America and I see a place like Miami, it's basically Latin America. And they've gotten so much Latin culture there, and it's very cool. I enjoy that sort of place. But I kind of understand that different cultures have different ways of going about things. Do you see any really good examples in the modern day of where multiculturalism is working?
So let me back up for just a second here, Jake, because this is a really important thing to set down. We have to make sure we're talking about the same thing when we talk about multiculturalism. I think a lot of the misunderstanding comes from not actually defining what we're talking about.
For sure.
So I like to distinguish between what I would call soft multiculturalism, which is where like you talk about, where you appreciate the contributions of other cultures and you participate in them to a large degree, and you eat different kinds of food, maybe participate in rituals or customs of a different culture and enjoy them and are open to them. That's what I would call soft multiculturalism. And soft multiculturalism has a broad consensus, I think, right now. I think it's something that almost everybody would agree upon. Sure. And soft multiculturalism, I would say, is not only is it not opposed to the melting pot, it's integral to the melting pot. It's precisely what the melting pot is about bringing in different cultures and sharing them and enjoying them. So I want to distinguish between that and what I would call a hard multiculturalism. Hard multiculturalism says that we keep cultures apart and we maintain their separate identities. And in many cases, we actually erect barriers. So how do we do that? Well, this notion of cultural appropriation is a perfect example of how you do that. So for example, cooking a cuisine that is not in your ethnic heritage, somehow that's bad. So for example, where I live in Oregon, there's a pair of restaurant owners who traveled all over Mexico. They gathered up recipes, brought them back to the U.S. and had them in their restaurant. And, they were boycotted and picketed and got death threats because one of them was part Asian, the other was, European descent. It's like, no, you're not allowed to make traditional Mexican recipes because you don't have Mexican heritage. So that's the hard multiculturalism. Yeah. Right. And you could almost say that hard multiculturalism is almost like multiple monoculturalism, because it says that every culture needs to be integral to itself. And there can't be any sharing or borrowing or any of that stuff that you see in Miami, for example. So I would say, what you see there is actually consistent with the melting pot. People always think melting pot means homogeneity. It doesn't. It never has, or it hasn't for at least 100 years. And that's what America is about. And I can give my own example. I grew up in mostly in southern Idaho, which is an area that's heavily Basque. So I learned Basque dances and participated in Basque weight carrying competitions when I was growing up, and that Basque heritage was sort of woven into the local culture. So to me, that's entirely consistent with the melting pot model. The key is that you have this superordinate identity that we all share. So,
Yeah.
so all my Basque buddies, a lot of them went on to be, a couple of them went to Annapolis. Others became Marines. They're identified as Americans. They remember that Basque heritage. In fact, one of them wrote a history of the Basque people, but nevertheless, they maintain that superordinate identity as Americans. And to me, that's the important thing.
So you think that these cultures can come together, and I tend to agree with you here, that there can be multiple cultures that can come together in one place, but there needs to be an umbrella of some sort. There needs to be an overarching identity that we all share. Do you think, though, that there are some cultures in the world that just don't gel in that sense, that it's actually almost technically impossible to have those cultures coming together? For example, if you look at in the current day, 2023, with all of the issues that are happening between Jews and Muslims at the moment, do you think that there's a possibility that some cultures are going to be so at odds with each other that they actually can't coexist together, that there's always going to be that real separatism?
Yeah, I hear that question a lot. And, I would just go back in history in the United States and remember that there was a time when Benjamin Franklin, for example, complained about the Germans. They'll never integrate. And you go forward, 50, 100 years, and they said the same thing about the Irish, same thing about the Italians. These groups, there is no way that these groups will ever integrate. So you can look at cartoons, Thomas Nast cartoons of the Irish around the turn of the century, and there are these horrible racist depictions of these terrible Irish who will never integrate. So I think that's always the fear that people have, yet over time, people always do. And I think oftentimes now the example that's given is Muslims. Well, Muslims have been in the United States for a long time. There were 15,000, not all Muslims, but at least partly Muslim Arabs fighting in World War I already. I've traveled through North Dakota, and there's Muslim community there that's been there for over 100 years. They have Islamic cemeteries there. So I don't think they're incompatible. It's a problem of identification. The conflict comes from how you identify. Simply dividing up into groups, and we're tribal by nature. And once you start that kind of tribal division, it can spread even between peoples who are very similar. On the flip side, you can unite people who are very different as long as you work on forging some sort of shared identity.
And this is the bit where I actually don't think that I've got a very well established worldview, if I'm totally honest, when it comes to the idea of multiculturalism. I think that in many ways, like I said before, it can work. And I am somebody who enjoys, like I said, the fruits of many different cultures. And I love the fact that you can go to different countries. And I think in terms of diversity, which is a topic that you talk about, the greatest form of diversity is being able to go to different countries throughout the world and being able to really feel like you're in that country. And when I went to Italy this year, for example, and I went to Naples, I felt like I was in Northern Africa. I felt like I was in Sub-Saharan Africa, brain fade, at times. and it kind of felt a little bit wrong to me. But then if I go to Sub-Saharan Africa, I've got no problem with Sub-Saharan Africans. But when there's such a massive influx of these people to one country like Italy, and you feel like you lose the essence of what Naples is, or when you go to East London, I lived in East London for 3 years, and then you kind of feel like you're in Pakistan in various different places. I've got no problem with Pakistanis, but sometimes it feels as though the influx of immigration kind of it almost ruins the essence of what that place was. I guess that's the kind of sad part, and that's why the people who are living in those areas are justifiably a little bit upset about this. And I would argue that we haven't seen such a massive amount of immigration in like we're seeing in modern Europe at the moment for a very long time. I mean, is there any historical examples of there being such vast swathes of people immigrating to different places?
Yeah, so the United States, to give you some perspective, there was a huge influx of immigration in late 1800s, early 1900s. And that brought us up to about 15% of the population foreign born. in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on.
And where were those people from?
They were primarily from Western Europe.
Right.
There were, a lot of Germans, Italians, Irish, and in fact, at the turn of the century, it was 90% Western European immigration. We get, you fast forward to today, and that's almost flipped on its head. It's only about 10% Western European. So the mix has changed very different, and we've swung back up in the United States. So we're back to about 14% foreign-born. So if you look at foreign-born households, one out of four people in the U.S. lives in a foreign-born household right now. Interestingly enough, north of the border in Canada, they're up to about 23%. You guys in Australia, you're almost 26% foreign-born right now. Really high number.
Yeah.
What makes it different in both Australia and Canada is it's a very, very high mix of people from India who are primarily English speakers, and in many ways are acculturated to an Anglo type of at least linguistically, if not culturally. So really, historically, this is almost unprecedented to have that big an inflow, and I totally agree with you. There is an issue of losing the culture that's already there, just having it swamped, overrun. So I was just in Sweden last week, and they're up around close to 20% immigration. And they went from like 0 to 20% in a decade, and they're very worried because they feel like their culture is going to be ceased to exist.
Haven't they just passed there's something happening in Sweden that people who earn under a certain amount are going to be deported? Did I read that right?
I don't believe that's correct. They're starting to limit the immigration there because they are worried about it. But I haven't read anything about people being deported.
I read something last week. It might have been something that somebody just proposed within the Swedish government, but there was something to do with people who earn under a certain amount. They were going to deport them, and people seemed quite bullish about it on Twitter, but you can't take anything from people being bullish on Twitter. So
I haven't, maybe that's been proposed. I certainly haven't heard of anything like that being passed, but yeah, they're very worried that, Sweden now is number 2 in the world for the rate of rapes. It's right below South Africa for that. And they'll argue, we changed the definition of what constitutes rape back in 2018. But the reality is that it was going up before they made that change, and it went up after they made that change. So you can't attribute it to that change. Not to mention, immigrants there, like I said, is somewhere between 15 and 20%. And they account for roughly half the rapes, so at least double their proportion in the overall population. And that's very concerning. They have strict gun control there, but they've had bombings go up. It's now the bombing capital of the world too. And of course they've got a lot of concerns about that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it can be quite an uncomfortable conversation to have, especially if you're somebody like myself who's trying to figure it out, but you don't really want to step on any tripwires and have the wrong perspective about it that makes you look a certain way. But like I'm from Melbourne, but I'm from a place called Footscray in Melbourne, which is the western suburbs of Melbourne, which is, if I look left, I've got very dense African communities, and then very dense Lebanese communities, and Turkish and Asian and Indian. And this is a very, very multicultural place. All of the suburbs that I'm talking about all have their different little ethnic enclaves of people, but it seemed to work pretty well. And it's just how I grew up. So I don't really know any different, if I'm honest. So I think that that's a pretty good example of how things work. And I think that Melbourne and Australia is a pretty good example of how multiculturalism can work. But then, like we were just saying, when you look at places like Sweden that are typically very culturally homogenous, when you get such a vast influx of people within such a short space of time, eventually you feel like there's going to be an inevitable tension that's happening. And I think that we might be seeing that boiling over in Britain at the moment. you're seeing the huge protests that are happening in London, and I saw a video yesterday. Once again, shouldn't take anything about off videos of Twitter. Don't say anything. They don't really tell you too much. But there was a bunch of, Arsenal supporters, English guys, who were going up to the protesters and yelling at them, and then there's all this fighting, and it just feels as though something's bubbling up in that country, and it feels as though it's the result of an untethered immigration where the people's concerns haven't really been listened to, as in the English people's concerns. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think that most societies, and especially a society like the United States that has a long record of assimilating people, a large degree of immigration can exist, and it can work out. And it only becomes a problem when you start to implement policies in your schools where you're teaching that those groups are separate and that they should have separate identities. And that's what I go into in my book, and what's so troubling right now, what's happening in the United States. So I'll give you a few examples.
Yes, please.
My son, who just graduated from USC earlier this year, they had 6 different graduation ceremonies, one for Black people, one for Asian Pacific Islanders, one for Hispanic, and so on. Colombia had 7 of those.
It's ridiculous.
It starts at the very beginning. So kids go to these universities and they have a separate orientation session for each set of kids, for each ethnic group. So they're being told that they're separate. And then when they go to live someplace, they go to live in these separate, ethnic theme houses. Theoretically, yeah, a white person could go and live in, Africa House, but let's just say that wouldn't be so easy to do. So you're promoting this idea of separate groups over and over again, and that's what my research has shown, is that has really profound effects, and it can end very, very badly. And to give you a direct comparison, so when I was in Yugoslavia, a Bosniak friend of mine was telling me about his son going to school. He walks to school with his Croat neighbors. When they get to school, the Bosniaks go in one door, the Croats go in the other door. The playground has a fence down the middle, Bosniaks on one side, Croats on the other. So these are called 2 schools under one roof. And I'm thinking, how much different from that is, say, Stanford, where you have separate graduation ceremonies.
So you're talking about, like, not in America, that's not happening with the Bosniaks and the Croats.
That's in Boston.
Yeah, right. Okay, cool. I thought so.
And historically, so they're taught separate things, which in a sense they are in the United States too. You have these ethnic studies programs that are primarily attended by people of whatever group you're talking about. So they're taught these different histories and histories of oppression and victimhood. And that has some real effects. And, we saw that, you could see how Bosnia ended. Same thing in Rwanda. The kids there before the genocide went to school and they had to stand up the first day of school and identify themselves as Hutu or Tutsi. And then the teachers would go on and on about Tutsi oppression over the Hutus and Tutsi privilege. Doesn't that sound familiar?
It
Tutsi
does sound eerily familiar.
So they were raised with that for 20, 30 years, and is it any surprise you end up with a genocide when you have children being inculcated from day one with this set of difference, of this set of this idea of us and them. And there's been a ton of sociological research that says you can take a homogeneous group of people and divide them up arbitrarily, have a blue group and a red group, and then maybe you favor one group over the other a little bit. And before you know, and some of these experiments that they did with, mostly teenage boys, they ended up with knife fights between the 2 groups when they did this, just by forming a red group and a blue group. That is in human nature. Once you start a group division, you unleash some really nasty tribal forces. The best scenario is that you just have a society of people who are unwilling to make sacrifices for each other and do all the things that make a society a nice place to live in. The worst outcome is Bosnia. It's former Yugoslavia. It's Sri Lanka. Any number of other places where they've gone down that road. A lot of them end in genocide.
Yeah, I'm actually, I've got Yugoslavian background. My great grandfather immigrated after World War II from what's now Croatia, but we're Italian ethnically, but from the Croatian part of Yugoslavia. And we went back there this year and we visited in Pula.
Yeah, I know exactly where that is.
Yeah, so but he was basically, they were going to kill him if he didn't leave, so he had to get out of there. But in terms of having to unite under one banner, what are some of the most effective strategies throughout history? You mentioned Rwanda before and how badly that went. What are some of the better strategies throughout history where we've seen, countries or nations or empires being united under a certain banner? And what were they? Were they nationalism? Were they religion?
A lot of it is just about having people work together at a common goal. Bringing people of different backgrounds together and working on a common enterprise. And, interestingly enough, Rwanda, after their genocide, they did a 180-degree turn. After the genocide happened, obviously there were some reprisals from Tutsis against Hutus for what had been done, but the government took a policy after the genocide. They said, from now on, there are no more groups. We're all Rwandans. That became their national motto. We're all Rwandans. And they instituted a number of public programs that had people working together. One is called Umuganda, which is this event they have once a month. It's on the third Saturday of each month, where the entire country comes out and works together, digging, cleaning out drainage ditches, working on schools. And it's like this big community event. And if you go there and witness this, it's Hutus and Tutsis working side by side on the same thing. And it produces this sense of communal pride that's really incredible. One of the results of it is that you go to Kigali and it's like the cleanest place in the world. I mean, it's like Singapore or Zurich, Switzerland.
You've been to Rwanda recently?
Yeah, it's the last time I was there, I think, was 3 years ago. It was just pre-COVID, actually.
Isn't it fascinating how they've gone from a genocide, 30 years ago, and to now being one of the sort of they're one of the tech hubs of Africa, and they've got a massively rising economy. It's remarkable what can happen in a few generations.
Yeah, this is a country where, like you said, 25 years ago, they had a genocide. And because they did this thing, they said, no more Hutus and Tutsis. We're all Rwandans. And it's basically, you can't have a political party based on ethnicity or color or anything like that. That's absolutely forbidden. It's in the Constitution. You're not allowed to distinguish people by group. And that pervades the entire society right now. So I talked to some American expats there who are doing business, and when they get a job application, everything about that might indicate somebody's ethnic, racial, or even gender is blotted out. All they can see is the person's qualifications. I mean, obviously, when they interview them, they'll know more. But the initial application, they're deliberately blotted out, so they can only distinguish based on people's actual qualifications. So you have a society now where those, for 25 years, any kind of distinction between groups has been strictly discouraged, and this national identity has been promoted. And it's worked really, really well. I mean, this country, they were dead last in living standards after the genocide. I mean, in the world, they were dead last. And they had the highest economic growth in the world for 20 years. And now it's a pretty nice place. You go to Kigali, it's way safer than just about any American city you could go to. And people get along. There's a sense of community there that's just amazing. Somebody did a poll, it was only a few years ago, it's maybe 2018, I think, where people were asked if they would trust their kids with a person of a different racial or ethnic background, which probably meant if you're a Tutsi, leave your kids in the care of Hutus. And 95% of the people in the country said, yeah, they'd have no problem with that. That's the level of trust that's been recovered there, which, you think of where they came from. That's incredible. And it gives us all hope, right? And
it does. I feel as though we're just marching in the complete opposite direction sometimes, though. And I do wonder, you've mentioned a lot of sort of sociological studies, and Thomas Sowell has done a lot of work in this field as well. And it seems to me obvious that there needs to be some sort of a uniting cause that people can all sort of, be at one with, whether or not that's ideology or whatever it may be. That seems quite obvious to me. But it also seems very obvious to me that we're doing exactly the opposite at the moment in the West, and we're trying to magnify the differences that we've got, and all the racial differences and what have you. And I'm wondering if you believe that this is an intentional thing that's happening, or if we're just ignorantly ignoring the data.
I think to some degree it's intentional. What I talk about in my book a lot is what I call the ethnic opportunist. And these are political or intellectual figures that gain prestige and traction by pitting different groups against each other. People like, Slobodan Milosevic is a perfect example of that. Franco Tudjman in Croatia. And we see that right now. A guy like Ibram X. Kendi or Robin DiAngelo, these folks make over $1 million a year giving speeches about, how white people enjoy unearned privilege. So that there's a huge incentive there. There's also an incentive, I think, among elite people of the majority group, whether it's in the United States or Australia, that they're able to do a lot of virtue signaling by playing up group differences and by focusing on so-called white oppression or white privilege. So yeah, I think it is deliberate to an extent. And people also don't know what they're doing. And yeah, I see it over and over again. To give you just another example, with my own son, my youngest son was in the national debate tournament in the U.S. here earlier this year. It's like a 4-day event. The first day of this event was entirely devoted to ethnically segregated coaches' meetings. 9 a.m. for Latinx, 10 a.m. for Black, Asian, Pacific Islander. An entire day out of a 4-day event. It's all about.
And these are just examples that you're seeing on the ground as well. I mean, you can't imagine how prevalent this is.
Yeah, it is incredibly prevalent, and we see it in the school curricula. It is absolutely pervasive in our society right now, and this breeds bad stuff, and that's what my book shows over and over again. Is again, the best case is you end up with a society that just lacks a sort of cohesion. It's a low trust society. And Robert Putnam, who's a sociologist from Harvard, did a lot of work on this, and he went around America and to ethnically divided communities, and he found that there was the sense of what he called hunkering down. When people feel like they're in a divided community like that, they pull back, they stop making the sort of civic contributions and volunteering in a way, doing all those things that makes a society a nice place to live in. They stop doing that, and they pull back, and they sit inside with their internet and their television and don't participate. And
it's very sad.
So that's bad in itself. But the worst thing that can happen and does happen all the time is that you end up with actual violence in the schools, in the streets. And, there are just so many examples of that, of where that course has turned nice societies into horrible places. You're probably somewhat familiar with Sri Lanka, and we saw that there too. I mean, this is a country I was just watching, you can see on YouTube, there's a 1950 TWA commercial about going to Sri Lanka. And it showed, talked about how democratic it was and how what a wonderful place. Really educated people, one of the best places in the world. In fact, the British colonialists said after World War II, this is the best bet in Asia. This country's going to do really well. So 2 years after independence, what do? They get rid of their shared language, their link language, which was English at the time. And they put Tamils and Sinhalese, who are the two different groups, they put them on separate educational tracks. Tamils in one group, Sinhalese in another group. And then they decided that because Tamils were better off than the Sinhalese, we need some affirmative action. So they started an affirmative action program. And before you know it, the two groups are clashing. And you end up with a 50-year on-again, off-again civil war and more or less a genocide of the Tamils. And this is a country that was destined to be better off than Singapore. And now this beautiful country is a hellhole. Why? Because they decided that they were going to make group distinctions.
It kind of
be very careful about that.
This is what I was going to say as well. I mean, your book, Out of the Melting Pot into the Fire, I need to get it when I get back to Australia because I'm traveling at the moment and I need to order it on Amazon because I couldn't find it on Audible. And normally I'll walk around in the morning and listen to books, but I'm going to get it when I get back to Australia. But I wanted to jump at the chance to speak to you today. But in terms of America, I'd like to explore different areas of the internet. And I like to see what different styles of commentary and what they're saying. And I'm seeing a rising tide at the moment of people who are spouting very nationalistic sort of sentiment. And on the extreme ends, white nationalist sentiment. And I think that's becoming a lot more popular. And I think that largely that can be attributed to the fact that nobody has been listening to the concerns of these people for a little while, and they're sort of pushing them to dark corners of the internet, and they're gathering there, and now they've got their common enemy, and then these ideas are becoming more and more prevalent. So these are, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is kind of how these civil wars have happened in the past in these other countries.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I've been asked about this a bit, and that when you talk about the white nationalism, whether and it's definitely on the rise. You see the AfD party in Germany, Marie Le Pen in France, and so on. That is a reaction to this other thing, this group division that we've been talking about. And what happens is when one side tribes up, the other side's going to tribe up too. It's just the natural course of things. And one example I like to give is we had Judge Sotomayor in the United States, right, when she was appointed to the Supreme Court. She said that she could, as a wise Latina, she was somehow genetically special and could bring something to the Supreme Court that somebody of a different ethnic background couldn't bring. So a couple of years later, Donald Trump tries to disqualify a Hispanic judge. I shouldn't even say Hispanic. This guy was second or third generation, of Mexican descent, and he basically said the same thing, that this judge can't judge fairly because he has, he's got Latin American genes. They're two sides of the same coin. So if you make everything about race, everything will be about race, right? And that's what's been done in this country for the last, decade or so. We've made everything about race. So now a lot of people are coming out of the woodwork.
Do you think that there's a tribal instinct that people have within ourselves to be a part of a group? For example, like the Japanese, I like to use this as an example because when you're there, it's very obvious to you that the Japanese are very, very nationalistic people, and they really want to keep Japan Japanese. So with what you're saying, it kind of seems to me as though there is a way to harness people's desire to be a part of a team in a good way. in the sense that we can all be a part of a team and we can all strive towards something, and we don't have to be separated in that pursuit.
Yeah, that's really what it's about. And this is something that's obviously a lot easier for a country like the United States, because the United States from the beginning was not founded on an ethnicity, right? It was founded on Enlightenment ideals. And from the beginning, it was very, very multi-ethnic, right? You go to the city of New Amsterdam, what we now call New York. It had 1,000 people in it in the 1600s. 18 different languages were spoken there. So the United States has it a lot easier than a country like Japan or, say, Germany or France, countries that were really founded on the basis of a particular ethnicity. So it's more of a problem for them than it is for us, because we've long had this paradigm where people can come in and meld in very easily because they're not distinguished by their identity. Now,
right. Yeah.
In Thailand, where you are, it's an interesting contrast, though. So that is somewhat an ethnically founded country. Yet, Thailand, as you know, has a pretty big intermixture of Chinese people, Chinese Thai, who are very well integrated, and they fight in the Thai army. They're totally loyal as Thai people. And one of the reasons that that's been allowed to happen is that the government there has never pursued a policy of distinguishing by group. Yeah. So Thai Chinese, they actually are, if you look at the demographics, they're slightly wealthier, they're slightly better educated than people are 100% ethnically Thai. But there's never been any affirmative action or any means to correct that. So the two groups there, they've melded very well and they get along very well, to the point where the distinction, I at least my sense of it always there, it was kind of like eye color or something. It's like, oh yeah, my background's Chinese, mine is Thai.
I feel like that might be changing a little bit, though. I mean, I spent a little bit of time in Cambodia this year as well, and I've spent a fair bit of time in Cambodia. And I feel as though since China have really aggressively pursued the Belt and Road Initiative, that the attitudes have changed a little bit, because there's a lot of infrastructure, and even in Bangkok, my friend is a native Thai guy, and he was driving me around. He was saying, "Oh, there's all the Chinese buildings. There's the Chinese buildings." And then when I was in Cambodia as well, there's parts of Cambodia where the Chinese have set up these huge factories, and they have all of these like basically like slave labor coming in and doing all of this really cheap labor, and it's causing a lot of problems. And they've basically taken the whole of Chinookville. Do you know Chinookville in Cambodia? Yeah. And they've developed that. And I was there in 2015 or 2014, and it was beautiful. This like beach town, bars on the beach. And now the Chinese came in and they sort of built it up, and then they abandoned all the projects. It was going to be like the Macau of Cambodia. And then they've abandoned all of those projects. And now there's all of these like basically slave labor people there who don't have any work and who are just sort of sleeping in the abandoned buildings. And there's all these little civil wars going on, and it's turned it into this crazy place. So I do know what you're saying in terms of the Chinese people who are assimilated into the culture in Thailand, but I do think that the Belt and Road is causing a bit of friction.
It absolutely is. Although it's interesting. A couple of years ago, I read something in one of the Thai newspapers, and it was Thai Chinese complaining about mainland Chinese tourists embarrassing them. They were saying, yeah, this is not us. These Chinese tourists who come in and misbehave and do bad stuff, and they were disassociating themselves from that, and I think somewhat successfully. But yeah, so there's a big contrast between there and just a little bit south. You go to Malaysia, that's had a Chinese population for 500 years, and there it's a very stark distinction, and there's a great deal of friction between those two groups. Well, why? Because Malaysia has one of the longest living affirmative action programs in the world. Starting in the 50s, they started discriminating against the Chinese because they were more successful. And what has that done? Well, it hasn't made the Malays any warmer towards the Chinese. In fact, it's it's fueled this sort of sense of difference, and that sense of difference ends up in bad stuff. They still have riots where they'll claim that the Chinese are plotting to do this or that, and then there's an anti-Chinese riot. And that's that is the fruit of distinguishing people by group and by assigning preferences by group. And
I've noticed that it is quite different. I think like Penang is very Chinese, isn't it? Like there's a lot of Chinese infrastructure in Penang, and then Kuala Lumpur is more Malay. If I'm not mistaken.
It's spotted around the country actually. So yeah, if you go to Langkawi, for example, that's a little more Chinese.
Yeah. So in terms of like the modern world, I mean, when you really want to get to the meat and potatoes of multiculturalism in the modern world and some of the more hairy situations, I think we can look at all of these different places in Asia, and a lot of them have quite a bit of history, and you can sort of look at the data. And then you look at Britain, for example. This is the one that I trip on, because sometimes I feel as though it's like oil and water meeting in terms of British culture and then Islamic culture. And you've done like extensive research into Islam. So in terms of your research into Islam and the theology of Islam, and then looking at British culture, do you think that this is a situation that is beyond repair, or is there a way forward? Because I can't see one when I look at that situation.
Yeah, that is it is a tough one there. Inherently, I don't believe that Islam is incompatible with Western democracy. I don't think it needs to be. And again, I think the problem here is more one of identification. And once you start to identify differently, you play up all the little differences, because we have many devout Muslims in the United States that are very well integrated. And I think in France, likewise, they have a problem because they are trying to force kind of in a one-way assimilation way on Muslim immigrants, not allowing them to wear hijabs, for example. And
yeah, I think that the thing that trips me up about it is that I actually don't know if there would have been a way to make what has happened peaceful. But maybe I'm a little bit sort of Machiavellian in my view of the world, but I tend to think that there's different interest groups and power structures within the world that are competing for their own interest. When you look at the Chinese, for example, they want to spread Chinese influence. And when you look at Islam, for example, they believe that, Islamic culture should be the way that everybody views the world. Christians, they would love to have a Christian world. And all of these ideas are kind of fighting against each other. So when you get to a place where there's massive amounts of Islamic immigration, they're kind of like my friend Muhammad Ali, for example. He preaches on the street in London. I've got no problem with him preaching on the street. But if I was, in London and I had lots and lots of Muslims preaching on the street and trying to convert people, I might be a bit disgruntled by that. So do you think that there is a way that could have worked? Do you think that it's racist for British people to want to say, put on the brakes, maybe we should have X amount of white British people, just like the Japanese do? Because that's another thing that gets me sometimes, is that you look at Japan, for example, and nobody really sees them as racist because they want to be ethnically Japanese. But then when the white British say it, or the white Americans say it, all of a sudden they're white supremacists. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, like I was saying before, I think there is an argument to when you have an ethno nation like England or France, the people who live there should have a right to exercise that their culture not be overrun. I think, and I think there's a way to have immigration and not have your culture overrun. And if you keep the levels low enough, I think that will happen organically. And again, I think oftentimes the differences are played up. If you go back 3-4 decades, there was a strong movement of what they called Islamic modernists, Mutazili, who really believed in softening all the kind of harsher strictures within Islam. And unfortunately, in the last 3 decades, that group has sort of been overrun by people who more hardliners, and that has made it more difficult. And this is an evolution that you've seen in the Islamic world itself. So the first time I went to Cairo was early 80s, 1980, 82. There were women wearing short skirts there. The only women who even wore a hijab were peasant women from the countryside. So I went back there working when I was in business, and I taught a class to a bunch of engineers, and half of them were women, and they were all wearing hijabs, every single one of them. So 20 years, we went from mini skirts to burqas. And you see that the same in Iran. If you go back under the Shah, it was a similar transition. Or Lebanon. Lebanon was like Paris in the 1970s.
Yep.
And now everybody's wearing a burqa.
In Turkey at the moment, you can literally cross the river, and in Istanbul, on one side of the river, you've got the more sort of secular, trendy part, and you've got people. You feel like you're in like East London at times. You've got these trendy bars and people, drinking and having fun. And then you go to the other side of the river, and you've got the mosques, and you've got people wearing burqas, and it's this stark contrast. It's like between like Europe and Asia, Turkey's a good example like that. I wanted to move on from that because it's a sticky situation. I feel like we've gone there enough so far. Yeah. Legal immigration. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I watched this video the other day. I can't remember what his name was, but there was this guy talking about immigration. He was putting marbles. Basically, he was using the example of marbles, and he was saying, this is how these marbles represent African immigration, and these are the people who are poor in Africa, and these marbles represent the people who are poor in Latin America and Asia, etc. And he took out one little marble, and he said, this is the difference you're making when you take 1 million migrants. And it kind of put it into perspective about the drop in the ocean that taking in immigrants has in terms of actual global poverty. And then he made the point about legal immigration, and that sometimes when we are taking people out of these really poor countries, we're often taking the most productive people and the people who are going to help their economies the most. But that kind of conflicts with my own view that, for example, you look at a country like Venezuela, who have a very educated population, because before Hugo Chavez came into power, their economy was doing great, and you got lots of engineers and doctors and lawyers, and you feel like if you looked at a country like that and you took in a big chunk of their more educated people, then they'd be fantastic to come in and help your economy. But do you want to take the people who are the most productive from their society? So what's your view on that?
Yeah, that is a tough one. We look at the United States, for example, the average Indian American, Indian who comes from India, they make almost twice what the average person of European descent makes. Actually, you can even, if you look at Africans in the United States, people who immigrated from Africa in the last few years, from Kenya, Nigeria, and so on, they make on average more than the average white person in this country does. So we're definitely drawing some generally well-educated people from these countries, and it's good for us, bad for them, because we're drawing away some of the most talented people from those countries. And it's an interesting way to argue against immigration, that we're actually hurting those countries. And I think that argument can be made.
And I think one of the things I find really fascinating about places like Rwanda, and I'm actually going to go visit there next year, because I'm thinking about doing a documentary about the Rwanda genocide. So it's the first time I've said anything about it, but I'm currently working on a documentary about the killing fields in Cambodia, where we interviewed some of the last remaining survivors. I'm thinking about doing Rwanda next. But the thing I find so fascinating about places like Rwanda is the amount of economic progress that they've had. So you do feel sometimes as though they really need those hyper productive people. But if you are going to bring in immigrants from other countries, you do want to take the most educated ones. So I guess it's kind of it's a bit of a tricky one, and it's something that you do have to balance. But I don't really feel like it's something that gets talked about that much in terms of the immigration debate.
No, it doesn't. We think more in terms of what it's doing for us, and the United States isn't that in a way isn't that big on it. Canada and Australia, Canada has a point system. I think Australia has something similar where they value very highly the skills and language skills and the academic skills of the people coming in. So to the point, in Canada, like I said, it's 23% of their population are foreign born. Well, they account for like over half the PhDs in the country.
Right.
And I think Australia had something similar. But yeah, that side of it is rarely considered. I think one way to look at it, though, too, is that when these people come to the United States, to Canada, they don't break their connection with the place they came with. So they may actually be bringing partly their wealth back to their original country and some of what they learned in the United States, or whatever country they immigrated to.
So where you live in America, when you look at the way forward, I sense that you really reject the idea of identity politics, and you reject the notion that we should be focusing so much on whatever identity groups we belong to, and maybe more surrounded by, like we said before, something that we can all be under, like a banner that we can all be under, and also the individual.
Absolutely. Treating people as members of groups is just, it's one of the most dangerous things a society can do. It almost inevitably leads to bad things. At the very best, a lack of cohesion, and at the worst, actual ethnic conflict. And, I'll give you an example of the worrying trends we're seeing in the United States. So if you go back to 2000, 70% of Black people in our country thought that race relations were either good or very good.
Yeah.
You go now, move up 20 years, 2021, that percentage dropped from 70% to 33%.
In 2000 and when was that?
It was 2001 to 2021, so 20 years.
Right. Okay.
That
Interesting.
We went from 70% thinking the race relations were either good or very good to only 33% thinking that. Or to give you another example, in roughly 2012, you had about 25% of Black people thought they were held back by discrimination. You know what that percentage is today? It's almost 70%. In 10 years, we went from Black people feeling like they had agency, that they had control over their destinies, to basically, 3/4 of them thinking it's out of their hands, that their destiny is determined by racism. Those are really bad trends, and I think they correlate directly with the rise of identity politics in this country. We had a period when we had a Black president elected twice, yet somehow Blacks feel that race relations have gotten that much worse. That is not that is not progress. And I'll point to Sri Lanka as an example of how quickly things can deteriorate when you go down that path. You can go from having a really prosperous, wonderful country to a horribly divided one really quickly. And I'm afraid that's the path that we're on right now.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I do agree. And I did a video where I went around in the USA and was interviewing people about America and saying, do you think America's racist? And I think actually everyone that I interviewed said, yes, they believe America's racist. And that was sad for me to hear, because one of the things that I've noticed about America when I go there, it's so remarkably non-racist, in the sense that there is a genuine melting pot in all of these different places that you go to. Like when you go to LA, you've got all of you got a lot of like Latin people, and you got a lot of Black people, and you got a lot of whites, and then it's like Europeans. And then when you go to Miami, like I said, you feel like you're in Latin America sometimes. So America is a remarkably culturally diverse country. And like you said, they elected a Black president twice. And to think that people think that America is racist like that, and to think that 70% of blacks feel as though they're being held back, I feel like it's an idea pathogen that is going to lead us nowhere good.
Yeah, it's horribly destructive to take away the sense of agency from people. I like to give the example. I had one son who's in football and basketball here, and he'd complain to me that the ref is against us, and I would always deny that, even though it was true sometimes, right? The ref was in fact against them. But the worst thing for him to believe is that that's the case, because it removes the motivation to actually, to work as hard. Failure becomes an option because you can say it was someone else's fault.
Very true.
Yeah. So when you have, close to 70% of Black people feeling like they have no agency, that is extremely destructive. And
victim mentality, I think, is something that inherently breeds failure. But then even more scary is that victim mentality causes people to feel obviously like victims. And then when they feel like they're victims, they obviously have to have an oppressor. And the oppressor is oftentimes the white man. So then you get this whole, if you're white, you should just shut up. You should just not have an opinion. If you're white, you're an oppressor. You're inherently bad. You're racist, and all of these sorts of things. And the natural reaction to that is, over a prolonged period of time, you're going to get the pendulum swinging. You're going to get a counter movement to that. And sometimes I feel as though there are certain people who want to see this sort of very negative race relation, because, like you said, there's some big salaries being handed out.
Yeah, it's the DEI is it's a $7 billion industry right now. There are DEI degrees granted, and you have to know that if racism were to completely evaporate tomorrow, none of these people would say, "Oh, racism is gone. Our job's done. I'm going to go find a different line of work." They're not going to do that, right? Because that's their living. So they have a vested interest in maintaining that there's always a racist lurking around every corner, and oftentimes that means demonizing the other group, and it always ends badly. And if we go and look at what just happened in Israel here a little while ago, the horrific killings that happened there. What did that really come from? Well, in my mind, that came from an entire generation of Palestinian kids being brought up with this idea that they've been victimized by these terrible Jews. And sadly, that happens around the Arab and around the Islamic world. So if Ayaan Hirsi Ali had an interview recently where she was talking about how she was educated as a child, as she was in Somalia and then I think Kenya, and she couldn't believe it when she first met a Jew. She thought that Jews were like these magical creatures of tremendous maleficence, right? It's like, oh, a Jew is just an ordinary human being like me. Yeah. So that's the way these kids are being inculcated, and they get to 20 and then they can commit these horrific acts because they've been inculcated with the sense that there's this oppressive other. And I worry that we're doing a little bit of that in our own educational system, and the results of that are pretty bad.
Well, I think the one thing that, like I said before, this is something that I'm figuring out as I go, and it's something that is constantly evolving for me as I travel around and live in more places around the world and understand the way that different cultures work. But I think the thing that I've taken from this today is the idea of human beings being very tribal by nature, but also the fact that we can harness that tribalism for something better. And that we have to, I think the idea of not magnifying our differences is obvious, but something that maybe we should promote more because we're doing
absolutely.
the opposite at the moment.
We can have a super tribe. That is possible, and throughout history, and that's some of the some of the examples I give in my book of that worked very effectively for different regimes over history, as they created this notion of a super tribe, which it didn't mean erasing all those smaller tribal identities, but fostering a more embracing one that everybody could be part of. And that's how you make a working society. You don't make it by segment, focusing on those individual tribes, because that inevitably leads to clashes.
Well, Jens, thank you so much for joining me today. I feel like there's I feel like this idea for me is like a tangled up pair of headphones in your pocket, and I'm trying to sort of untangle it at the moment. But you've definitely helped me with that today. If you don't mind telling everybody where they can find you and where they can find your work.
Yeah, so my book is published by Encounter Books, so it's probably best to just go to their site, and they carry a lot of other great work. So I think a couple of Tom Sowell's books are now published and distributed by them, Roger Scruton, some others like that. But so Encounter Books, to find my book, Out of the Melting Pot into the Fire, that's really the best place to go.
And we're going to have that all linked below. So once again, Jens, thank you so much for joining me. And hopefully we can do this again, maybe in person when I'm in the States next year.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah, that would be really cool. So Perfect. Thank you.